Good evening. It is never an easy task to open a lecture series or a class in the infinite way, because it seems that this is one of those messages that once given should never need repetition. And yet, over and over we are discovering that it is not as simple a message to assimilate as we would like to believe. The message itself is very simple. It has to do really with something like this. Just let's hear this a minute. This is Galatians. Paul, an apostle, not of men, neither by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man, for I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. This message of the infinite way from beginning to end is nothing more or less than the statement that we of ourselves as human beings cannot live successfully, cannot live harmoniously, healthfully, nor in prosperity, nor in harmonious relationship with other men and women, but rather that there is another element that has to enter our experience. Paul calls it the Christ. Jesus called it the Father. Orientals call it the Buddha. What it actually means is a transcendental presence, a something that is beyond the human, but which takes over and lives the human, It lives in the human and through the human. It even lives as the human. But it is not the human living. It is not I that lives. It is this transcendental presence which lives my life, which lives as me, which is the measure of my intelligence, the measure of my love. In other words, I can have no intelligence of my own. I can have knowledge. Certainly I can read books and study them and memorize them and have lots of knowledge, but that is not having intelligence. Parrots and minor birds can have intelligence. But they cannot have and do not have that transcendental intelligence which is the true wisdom. They can have knowledge, they can be taught to speak, they can be taught to memorize. Animals can be taught to do tricks and memorize cues. But this is not the intelligence of which we speak. This is the knowledge that can be learned in books, the knowledge that can be learned from man. But spiritual intelligence, which manifests itself as the intelligence even of this world, comes from that spiritual source. In the same way, you cannot love and I cannot love. We can know human affection. We can know lust and sensuality, but we cannot love. Love is a quality, an activity of God, which is expressed through us. These other things, human affections and lust and sensuality, these are all creations of the human mind, the carnal mind, which are not of God and not under the laws of God, neither indeed can be. But love, the love that passeth understanding, the love that can bring peace into the heart of an individual or into the relationships of two or more people, this love is not of you and it is not of me, and you have none of it and I have none of it. God has it all, and when we open ourselves to the influence of God, then the love which is God flows through us, and then we are often called loving. However, we should answer as the Master did. Why callest thou me good? There is but one good. There is but one love. That's the Father within you and within me. If so be we open ourselves to let the Spirit of God dwell in us. Paul tells us that we are creatures, mortals, that we are not under the law of God, and indeed we cannot be under the law of God as human beings. It is only when the Spirit of God enters us, if so be the Spirit of God dwell in you, then do you become the children of God. Then do you become the instruments through which God lives, or, as Paul termed it, Christ lives your life. Now, all there is really to the message of the infinite way is this teaching that we of ourselves are nothing, nor indeed can be, that I can in my own self do nothing and be nothing and have nothing. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. But that as the Spirit of God dwells in me, we can hear, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. A human being living a life separate and apart from this listening attitude, this inner meditation, never hears the voice say, I am with you. Before Abraham was, I am with you. I will be with you unto the end of the world. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I am thy bread and thy wine and thy water. I am the resurrection. I am thy life eternal. But this presence, the Father within, or Christ, this presence is within you and me, for God is no respecter of persons. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And God is omnipresence. The place whereon thou standest is holy ground. For I and the Father are one. But none of this is true in the experience of those who are living their own lives. Those who are living as if they were an entity unto themselves, full and complete within themselves. This is true only of those who, by the grace of God, have been led to the realization that there is more to life than that which is visible. We speak often of the three worlds: the material, the mental, and the spiritual. While in the last analysis, in the final stage of demonstration, there is only one, until that stage is reached, there are not three, there are two: the mental and the spiritual, because that which we have termed the material is itself the mental. In other words, mind expressed as form is one and not two. You have evidence of that when you go through some of the examples that are used in our classwork to illustrate these points. For instance, we have used this, that my hand left to itself would stay here forever and forever and forever. It has no power of movement. It has no life. It cannot go forward or backward, up or down. It cannot give and it cannot withhold. It cannot pet and it cannot punch. All it can do of itself is just to stay here where it is. But the very moment that mind is realized, then mind becomes the activity of this hand, and the hand goes up or the hand goes down, or the hand gives or the hand withholds, or the hand pets or the hand punches, not of itself, for it has no volition, it has no action, it has no intelligence, There it is, and there it must stay until mind moves it. Therefore, mind itself is its essence, its intelligence, its action. Now, when we live, as most of the world does live, on the realm of mind and matter, or mind and form, or mind expressed as effect, you have a situation in which life can be either good or bad. In other words, the realm of mind, separate and apart from its source, which is spirit, mind outside of the Garden of Eden is both good and evil, has qualities and properties of good and evil, can be used for good or evil. And that is why there is no use blaming a body for its misdeeds. You cannot separate the body from the mind. That is the recognition of the Master when he said that the physical act of adultery was not the only sin, but merely looking upon a woman with lust was the same sin, because actually the body has no powers of adultery or any other action separate and apart from mind. Therefore, mind always determines the good body or the bad body, and equally it can determine the healthy body or the diseased body. As a matter of fact, disease cannot enter a body without mind. There is no possible way for a disease to enter body without mind. And the proof of that, of course, is that a corpse cannot become diseased, not any more diseased than it was when there was a mind there. No, a body cannot manifest disease. There must be mind to accept the powers of good or of evil. In other words, a body doesn't know whether it's sitting in a draft. And so a body can't catch cold sitting in a draft. There must be a mind there to accept the universal belief that sitting in a draft will give one a cold. Now, actually, there's no such law, but there is a universal belief which acts as a law. And in the same way, infection and contagion. A body can never be infected, and germs can never be contagious, separate and apart from mind. There has to be a mind believing in good and evil. That is why mental practitioners, as well as spiritual practitioners, can nullify the effects of disease germs, and they're doing it every day of the week in tens of thousands of cases every day, not by applying any remedies to those disease germs, merely by withdrawing from them or from the mind the belief that there are good germs and bad germs, that there are good powers and evil powers. And so it is, whether an individual were working from the plane of mental science or spiritual science, they should be able to nullify all forms of disease merely by withdrawing from their own mind the belief in two powers, good and evil. Now, as long as we are living the life of mind, we are functioning under the law, not under grace. And therefore, if there are disease germs in the air, we can become subject to them. And if we get in a draft or get our feet wet outdoors, we can catch cold. Good policy always is to get your feet wet in the bathtub, because that doesn't give you a cold. Outside of the bathtub, feet don't like the water. Unless you're in a swimsuit in the ocean. That makes it quite different. Feet will then take water. You see how foolish it all is? It's a universal belief of which we become victims by acceptance. In other words, ignorance of the law does not excuse us from its penalty. In other words, 99 9/10% of the world is not evil and is not suffering for any evil. It is suffering from its ignorance of spiritual laws. And specifically, the world is suffering from a belief in two powers. Now, as an individual accepts God, spirit, consciousness, as one power, one life, one cause, the mind becomes imbued with that truth and surrenders its belief in two powers. Now remember that neither you nor I gave ourselves this belief of two powers. The mere act of having been born, even before that, the mere act of having been conceived, placed us immediately under the law of two powers, so that even before we were born, something of an evil nature could have happened to us. Now, we as human beings exist with an inner conviction, belief of two powers. Everyone has that, and no matter how far you go, you still have it to some extent. You do not overcome this belief in two powers, not even with the resurrection. It is only with the ascension that one is completely freed of this universal belief of two powers. Jesus rose from the tomb still under the belief of two powers, and he had the power of those nails in his body. He had the power of the sword thrust in his body, the evil powers, the negative powers. Now, govern then, or rather, let us put it this way, living life from the standpoint of mind and matter, or mind and effect, mind and form, we are made up of two powers, and our lives conform to it. We have good experiences and bad, we have good health and bad, we have good luck and bad, we have abundant supply and lack, we have health and disease, and eventually we have life and death. And this must forever continue in the human experience, as long as the human experience is lived purely from the standpoint of mind and form. Now, in this teaching of the Master, we have a rising above the law. We have a rising in consciousness to where we are not subject to the law of good and evil, the law of two powers. And it is when we rise above the mind that we become aware of this transcendental presence which supersedes the laws of mind. The mind is an instrument, strangely enough, through which we become aware of that which will take from mind its powers of good and evil And that is why we have the resistance to truth. The human mind, individually and collectively, does not wish to surrender its belief in two powers. It does not wish to surrender its belief in its own creative powers. Now, as long as we ascribe creative powers to the mind, you must remember that we are ascribing the power to create good and to create evil. And this, of course, is demonstrated in the experience of all primitive races, where hundreds of years ago they were thousands of years ahead of all of our knowledge today of the mind. In other words, there isn't a university in the world teaching psychology or psychiatry or any subject related to the mind that is on the level today with the knowledge of the primitive races that they had 1,000 years ago. That's how far behind the times we are on the subject of mind. Now, these primitive races knew that the mind had two powers, that it could do good and that it could do evil, and therefore they had healers, but they also had those who could curse and kill. Wherever you found a primitive race that knew the powers of mind, you had those who would do healing works, and you had others who would do cursing works. So it has been in certain monasteries where the power of the mind was known, and you had those who were the white brotherhood and those who were the black brotherhood, meaning only those priests who used the power of mind or prayer for good, and then those who had desires of personal powers and used them for evil purposes. So it is in this day that we have men writing books on how you can benefit people and things by the use of your mind, and how also you can destroy them with the power of your mind. And that is true. That is the activity and operation of the human mind. If you learn the powers of the mind and your inherent nature is good, you will use these powers to bless, to heal, to bring peace, to bring harmony, and to bring joy. If, however, your nature has in it an element of ambition, you can use these powers then to serve your purpose. Glorify yourself, enrich yourself. The fate of these people is very sad in the end, but they do have their years of flourishing like a green bay tree. Now, as long as life is lived then, on this level of mind and form, the mind can be used to benefit form, to bless it, to heal it, to make it grow, or the mind can be used to destroy it, deplete it, harm it. If this were all there is to life, the world would be in a sad state, because we have many, many schools now throughout the land teaching people how to use their mind to control their fellow man so that they can get their own way in life. And that would mean that those who had that much energy and ambition could go to those schools and then come out, and the rest of us would just be willing victims of them and surrender to them ourselves and our wealth, like going out and buying popcorn or a Coca-Cola when someone tells us to do it, even if we at the moment don't want it. This is all the use of the mind, and if that was the level of human life in its entirety, the world would soon be lost. Every age has had powerful men who knew the power of the mind and how to use it for their personal and selfish purposes. Their ending is not difficult to understand. Their endings are always horrid ones. Little do they know that when they start, and even when they're told that, they believe that they are so powerful in the use of the mind that of course it can't happen to them, but it does. Now fortunately, none of us need be the victims of mind, even in the aspects of mind which are not deliberately evil in intent, but which are through ignorance evil in their effects upon us. For instance, since it is a universal mental belief that getting one's feet wet in the rain will give a cold, we have it within our power to use the power of the mind to nullify that belief. There are so many of these universal beliefs that we are victims of, that when we learn these truths, we can immediately begin to apply them and free ourselves from the negative aspects of the law. But this, of course, is a long, hard journey that does not end satisfactorily, because usually some unknown law comes along which we have no way of knowing or knowing how to handle. And so we come to the escape from this wheel of life, this merry-go-round of sometimes good and sometimes evil. And that is this way that has been revealed to us by the Master, and in some aspects confirmed by Paul, and which we now more thoroughly understand than has been the case for many generations. That is this way of opening ourselves to this transcendental presence, which is closer to us than breathing and nearer than hands and feet, this which the world calls God, Spirit, Consciousness. Now, rising to that level of life, you no longer have a struggle, nor do you have to use powers. You don't use the power of truth to overcome error. You don't use the power of God to overcome sin, disease, lack, or limitation. You don't go to God to have peace on earth established. In this, where I live yet not I, Christ liveth my life, there is a surrender of personal powers even for good. There is a yielding to that spiritual influence which itself governs, and governs harmoniously, joyously, abundantly, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. This is where the Master revealed, you have heard it said of old, tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye. But I say unto you, resist not evil. And of course, it has been interpreted to mean that we are to yield ourselves to evil, or to let the other fellow just do with us as he will. On the contrary, we deprive the other fellow of all power the moment we stop fighting him and come into agreement with spiritual law, which isn't really law, it is spiritual grace. In other words, well, let us return for a moment to the example of these germs that cause colds and flu and grip, and which do in the human world. The moment that we have accepted God, that is, the God revealed by Christ Jesus, you have accepted omnipotence. Omnipotence, of course, all power. All power as of God, of spirit, of consciousness. If you were to accept that literally, then you would have to say that these germs have no power unless it is a power derived from God. And you would be right. And you would then stop your antagonism to these germs. You would stop fighting them and treating them. And you would rest in this word. They have only the arm of flesh. They only have the power of human belief. Thou couldst have no power over me unless it came from God. And then you would find that which every metaphysician finds, every spiritual practitioner finds, that by not fighting germs, by not fighting laws of matter, infection, contagion, by not fighting, arguing against, or battling evil in any form, but in abiding in this word, resting in this word, they have only temporal power, the arm of flesh, nothingness. For omnipotence means that I, in the midst of me, the I that will never leave me nor forsake me, this is the only power. Now, whatever power germs have, or any other form of human discords, can have only such power as is derived from God, or such power as the human will give to it. It is exactly the experience of going into the desert, let us say for the first time, and finding a flood of water on the road in front of you, stopping your car and wondering how you're to get through this. And of course there is a temptation to look around to see if there are enough pails so that we can get out and bail ourselves out, or in some other way drain off this water so that we can go through. Now remember that as long as that water is water to us, we can't go through. If, however, we settle down into a period of quietness, inner quietness, to think the situation over, or to turn within for a little guidance and light, we probably would receive an awareness within ourselves in some form that this isn't water, this is a mirage. And we look up, the water's still there, but now we know the water isn't water. The water is a mirage, or nothingness, a false mental image. And so we start our car and bravely we ride right through the non-existing water. So it is in spiritual practice. The spiritual practitioner takes the case of any form of disease, the deathbed itself, and to what must seem to be very courageous to others, goes into this case or into the very household without a bit of fear or anxiety or rubber gloves or washing the hands with alcohol or any of these other precautions, and sits in quiet contemplation of this that we have just discovered, that the water on the desert isn't water, it is mirage. And applying this to our spiritual healing, we learn that disease isn't disease. It is this universal belief in two powers, the power of good and the power of evil. But omnipotence rules out any two powers and makes the belief of two powers a mirage. And that is exactly what this evil condition of sin, disease, lack, or death is to a spiritual practitioner. It is called in his language illusion. Not that the disease is illusion, not that the germs are illusion, but that the belief that there are two powers is illusion. Therefore, the belief that there is an evil power operating, a power of destruction. And so the disease, the fear, the lack, the limitation, the unemployment, to the spiritual practitioner is not those. These come under the heading of illusion, maya, appearances. Actually, if you wish to reduce it to the actual truth, every such appearance is a universal belief in two powers. That's all it is. You can reduce every claim of human discord, every theory that includes the belief of two powers, you can reduce every evidence of sin, disease, death, lack, and limitation to this one claim or one appearance, a belief or the universal belief in two powers. Now, you find how wonderfully you can do healing work as long as you don't personalize this belief and say it is your belief or your patient's belief or that it is my belief. As long as you can impersonalize it and see it as the Adamic belief, the universal belief, you'll find how quickly you will begin to nullify the effects of the two powers in your experience. Then you will see that this transcendental presence, this Christ, is living your life for you harmoniously and richly because you have overcome the world. It cannot take over and govern your life while you are under the belief in two powers, but in proportion as you can gradually train yourself away from appearances, as you can realize that this water on the desert isn't water, it's mirage, that this disease isn't disease, it is a universal belief in two powers, you will find that you are developing an entirely new state of consciousness. You are no longer under material sense or under the law, you are now under grace. The law is a belief in two powers. That's all there is to what the Master called the law. As long as you are under a belief in two powers, you are under the law of good and evil. The very moment that you begin, even in a small way, even if you can at this moment intellectually agree that it makes sense that in the view of ascribing omnipotence to God, that there really cannot be laws of good and evil, even if that humanly makes sense to you, that you cannot have omnipotence and two powers, from that moment on you can begin to apply that truth, or think that truth, or realize that truth with every appearance of two powers in your experience. And though for a day or two or three nothing may seem to happen outwardly, it will not be very long until you will begin to see that negative appearances are falling away in your life, that people who have been negative to you in their conduct now become in some measure positive, that whereas you have had people unfair, unjust, and so forth, unkind to you, their natures change to you, but you yourself have been responsible for it by not accepting good and evil as the measure of their conduct, by realizing that powers of good and evil could not operate in them any more than they can operate in you, for God is no respecter of persons. The great sin in the world is believing that God is doing something more for one than for another, or for one race than another, or one religion than another. All of that is just hogwash. God's rain falls on the just and the unjust, and what we are not enjoying of God's grace represents that degree of our ignorance of spiritual grace, of the nature of God. Whether we speak of individuals, or whether we speak of groups, or whole nations, they are suffering, or we are suffering, only in proportion to our ignorance of God. You know, many people have an idea that the prosperity of the United States, or the state of peace in which it has lived during its lifetime, and its wars, remember, have never had anything to do with this nation. They've only had to do with our entrance into world affairs. Many people believe that this is somehow accidental, or that it's just a coincidence or a matter of chance, or perhaps because we have a lot of coal in the ground or iron or crops. It's about as nonsensical as it can be. The prosperity and the harmony of this nation has come about because from its founding, God was incorporated into the very essence and fiber of its life, in its constitution, in its institutions, in its cornerstone layings, in everything that had to do with the government and its buildings and its operation. God, I don't mean that there haven't been plenty of men who have, and women who have desecrated these principles, who have torn them to shreds. Surely we know all about that. But as a nation, this is a nation that takes God into its life, into even the life of its government and its governmental forms, into its universal philanthropies, and therefore to that extent it has saved many horrors of the world. You will find this universally true. With all of the troubles that have beset England, its safety and its security is guaranteed in the fact that it was one of the first on the face of the globe to proclaim liberty and freedom for its citizens. It was one of the first to give in its national charter, constitution, Magna Carta, into its law the idea of justice, equity, even equality under the law. Now, in the degree that peoples incorporate the idea of God into their individual experience, in that degree do they free themselves from many of the discords and inharmonies of the world. Naturally, it is impossible to completely free oneself until the recognition of the origin of evil. It is only in proportion as we understand the origin of evil and how to deal with it that we can free ourselves individually and collectively from the world. I can tell you this, that praying to God to do something for the world isn't going to do anything for it. Because God has nothing more to give the world than He has given it. He is not withholding peace on earth. So there's no use praying to Him to give it to us. He is not withholding food from the ground. He is not withholding good. So trying to reach God through prayer is as close to being a waste of time as you can come. And the only thing that saves it from being an utter waste of time is that it does really include the word God, and that has some virtue, even when God is used in a mistaken sense. But God is the answer to peace on earth, to prosperity, to human relationships, but in the sense that God has established His kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. We are the ones separating ourselves from the experience or demonstration of the kingdom of heaven in proportion as we continue to be under the law of this belief in two powers. Now, no one can free you but you. Practitioners and teachers can free you from your immediate problem, physical, mental, moral, financial. If you work seriously and earnestly with them, there isn't any condition from which you're suffering that a practitioner of understanding cannot eventually, sooner or later, bring you into your freedom. But that is of very little purpose unless you intend to carry it further and learn the principle behind that experience and begin to bring it into your own experience. Even the Master, great as he was and great as he is, for he still functions here on earth, great as he was and great as he is, could not save his disciples or their followers, each from taking their own footsteps, and he cannot save us. Any of us today may have a healing through the intervention of that divine grace, but it would only be a healing. We still have a lifetime to work out before us, and that we can do only as we individually will work with principles. Now, in our work in the infinite way, I have worked out a program both in tapes, monthly letters, and books stating this principle with which I myself have been at work professionally for 30 years in such form that anyone with serious enough intent can learn it, can practice it, and bring its benefits into their experience. I can help them to a certain extent, and so can some of our associates in the work. But if I go not away, the Comforter cannot come to you. In other words, except as you individually are willing to put in your period of discipleship, your period of studenthood, the period of studying and practicing, the freedom cannot come to you.